Chapter 1: The Last Normal Day. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Jack Malone's modest apartment, casting long, slatted shadows across the cluttered living room. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the counter, next to a stack of unpaid bills and a crumpled lottery ticket. Jack sat at the edge of his worn leather couch, staring at the blank TV screen, his mind racing. Today was the day. The day he'd been planning for months. The day he'd either become a millionaire or end up in a body bag. He ran a hand through his unkempt brown hair, his fingers trembling slightly. He wasn't a criminal, not really. At least, he hadn't been until 6 months ago. But life had a way of pushing people to the edge, and Jack had been teetering on that edge for years. His job as a security consultant for armored transport companies had given him an inside look at how the system worked. And more importantly, how it could be broken. The plan was simple, at least in theory. An armored truck carrying $1 million in cash would make its usual stop at the downtown bank at 10:15 a.m. The guards would follow protocol. 2 inside the bank, 1 in the driver's seat, and 1 stationed by the rear doors. Jack knew their routines, their weaknesses, and the blind spots in their security. He'd spent weeks memorizing every detail, every contingency. But even the best-laid plans could go sideways, and Jack knew that one mistake could cost him everything. He stood up, his legs feeling like they were made of lead, and walked to the small table by the door. On it lay a black duffel bag, already packed with the tools of his new trade. A stolen security badge, a modified radio jammer, a pair of gloves, and a handgun he'd bought off a shady dealer in the city's underbelly. He stared at the bag for a long moment, his stomach churning. This was it. No turning back now. The drive to the bank was a blur. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He parked his car 2 blocks away, in a quiet alley where he wouldn't be noticed. He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The city buzzed around him, oblivious to the storm brewing in his chest. At 10:10 a.m., he was in position, leaning casually against a lamppost just outside the bank. He watched as the armored truck pulled up, right on schedule. The guards stepped out, their movements routine and unhurried. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he reached into his pocket and activated the radio jammer. The guards' comms would be useless now, at least for the next few minutes. That was his window. He moved quickly, slipping around the side of the truck as the guards disappeared into the bank. The driver was still in his seat, but he was distracted, scrolling through his phone. Jack tapped on the window, flashing the stolen badge. The driver rolled his eyes but unlocked the door. Big mistake. In one fluid motion, Jack yanked the door open and pressed the gun to the driver's temple. "Out! Now," he growled, his voice low and steady. The driver's face went pale, but he complied, raising his hands and stepping out of the truck. Jack shoved him to the ground and climbed into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking now, but he forced himself to focus. He had to move fast. The engine roared to life, and Jack peeled away from the curb, the tires screeching against the pavement. In the rearview mirror, he saw the guards running out of the bank, their faces twisted in confusion and rage. But it was too late. He was already gone, the truck weaving through traffic as he headed for the outskirts of the city. The duffel bag sat on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of what was at stake. Jack's mind raced as he drove, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of fear and exhilaration. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. But the hardest part was yet to come. Disappearing with $1 million in cash wasn't going to be easy. The cops would be after him, and so would the people he'd stolen from. He'd have to stay one step ahead of them all. As he crossed the city limits, Jack allowed himself a small, grim smile. He was a criminal now, whether he liked it or not. But for the first time in years, he felt alive. The money was just the beginning. The real challenge was staying free, and staying alive. The road stretched out ahead of him, endless and uncertain. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed down on the gas. There was no going back now. Chapter 2: The Turn. The adrenaline that had carried Jack through the heist began to wane as he drove farther from the city. The armored truck felt like a cage now, its heavy bulk a constant reminder of the weight of what he'd done. The duffel bag sat on the passenger seat, stuffed to the brim with cash. $1 million. It was more money than Jack had ever seen in his life, and yet it felt like a curse. He had a plan, or at least the outline of one. Ditch the truck, transfer the money to a nondescript sedan he'd stashed in an abandoned warehouse, and disappear. New identity, new life, somewhere far away where no one would ask questions. But plans had a way of unraveling, and Jack's was no exception. The first sign of trouble came when he reached the warehouse. The sedan was gone. Jack slammed his fist against the steering wheel, cursing under his breath. He'd paid a guy to leave the car there, no questions asked. But the guy had apparently taken the money and run. Jack was stranded, with a stolen armored truck and a bag full of cash he couldn't spend. Panic set in. He couldn't stay here. The cops would be swarming the area soon, and the truck was too conspicuous. He grabbed the duffel bag and climbed out, scanning the empty lot for options. There was a gas station a mile down the road. Maybe he could steal a car there. It was a risk, but he was out of options. The walk to the gas station felt like an eternity. Every passing car made his heart skip a beat. He kept his head down, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, trying to look like just another guy on the road. But the weight of the bag and the guilt in his chest made him feel anything but ordinary. When he reached the gas station, he saw his chance, an old pickup truck parked by the pumps, its engine still running. The driver was inside, paying at the counter. Jack hesitated for a moment, then made his move. He tossed the duffel bag into the bed of the truck and climbed into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the wheel. "Hey!" a voice shouted. Jack looked up and saw the truck's owner running toward him, a middle-aged man with a baseball cap and a look of outrage on his face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jack's heart raced. He didn't have time for this. He threw the truck into gear and hit the gas, but the man grabbed the door handle, yanking it open. "You're not going anywhere, you thief!" the man yelled, reaching in to grab Jack. Everything happened in a blur. Jack's hand went to the gun in his waistband. He didn't mean to pull the trigger. He just wanted the man to let go. But the gun went off, the sound deafening in the confined space. The man stumbled back, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock. Blood bloomed across his shirt as he collapsed to the ground. Jack froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world seemed to slow down around him. He could hear the gas station attendant screaming, the sound of a phone being dialed. He looked down at the gun in his hand, then at the man on the ground. What had he done? The weight of it hit him like a sledgehammer. He hadn't meant to shoot anyone. He wasn't a killer. But it didn't matter now. The man was dead or close to it, and Jack was the one who'd pulled the trigger. He was a criminal, a thief, and now a murderer. He threw the truck into gear and sped out of the gas station, the duffel bag bouncing in the bed behind him. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. He'd lost control, and now there was no going back. The money didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except getting away. But as he drove, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was a wanted man now, not just for the heist but for murder. The cops would be after him, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. He had no plan, no allies, and no way out. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he deserved this. That he'd brought it all on himself. Jack clenched his jaw and pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. Not ever. The pickup truck roared down the empty highway, carrying him farther into the unknown. Jack Malone was a man on the run, and there was no telling where the road would take him. But one thing was certain, there was no going back. Chapter 3, The Watcher. Ethan Cross sat cross-legged on the floor of his childhood bedroom, the glow of 3 computer monitors casting an eerie light across his face. The room was a shrine to his obsessions, shelves lined with books on hacking, cryptography, and true crime, posters of vintage tech ads peeling at the corners, and a whiteboard covered in scribbled notes, strings of code, and a sprawling web of connections that only Ethan could decipher. At 22, he was a self-taught prodigy, a digital savant who spent his days working a dead-end IT job and his nights diving down internet rabbit holes. Tonight, he was deep into a new case. A local news alert had popped up on his feed earlier that evening. Armored truck heist ends in shooting. Suspect at large. The story was light on details, but Ethan's curiosity was piqued. He'd always been drawn to puzzles, and this one had all the makings of a good one. $1 million stolen, a civilian shot, and a suspect who'd seemingly vanished into thin air. It was the kind of story that fascinated him, the kind that made him feel like he was part of something bigger. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up police scanners, social media feeds, and dark web forums. He had a knack for finding information others overlooked, for connecting dots that didn't seem to belong in the same picture. It was a skill he'd honed over years of amateur sleuthing, solving cold cases and unmasking online scammers for no other reason than because he could. He didn't do it for fame or money. He did it because the world made more sense when he could piece it together. "Ethan," his mom's voice called from downstairs. "Dinner's ready. Be there in a minute," he shouted back, not looking away from the screens. He was close to something. He could feel it. The suspect's name hadn't been released yet, but Ethan had already dug up a few breadcrumbs. A stolen security badge, a modified radio jammer, and a blurry gas station security photo of a man in a hoodie climbing into a pickup truck. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He leaned back in his chair, chewing on the end of a pen as he studied the photo. The man's face was obscured, but there was something about his posture, the way he carried himself, the tension in his shoulders, that struck Ethan as familiar. He couldn't place it, but he knew he'd seen it before. "Ethan James Cross, if you don't come down here right now, your father's going to eat all the mashed potatoes," his mom yelled again, her tone sharper this time. Ethan sighed and saved his work, reluctantly pushing away from the desk. His parents didn't understand his hobby, as they called it. They thought he was wasting his time, that he should be out making friends, or dating, or doing whatever normal people did. But Ethan didn't care about normal. He cared about solving problems, about uncovering the truth. And right now, the truth was out there, waiting for him to find it. Downstairs, the Cross family dinner was in full swing. Ethan's dad was already halfway through his plate, while his mom hovered by the stove, stirring a pot of gravy. The TV in the corner was tuned to the local news, and Ethan's ears perked up when he heard the anchor mention the heist. Authorities are still searching for the suspect, described as a white male in his late 30s or early 40s. The victim, identified as 54-year-old Carl Henderson, was pronounced dead at the scene. Police are urging anyone with information to come forward. Ethan's mind raced as he sat down at the table. Carl Henderson. The name meant nothing to him, but it was another piece of the puzzle. He made a mental note to look into Henderson's background later, to see if there was any connection to the suspect. "You're awfully quiet tonight," his dad said, eyeing him over the rim of his glasses. "What's going on in that head of yours?" "Nothing," Ethan muttered, shoveling a forkful of mashed potatoes into his mouth. He knew better than to bring up his investigations at the dinner table. His parents didn't get it, and he didn't feel like explaining. But as he ate, his mind kept drifting back to the case. There was something about it that felt personal. Maybe it was the way the suspect had spiraled out of control, going from thief to murderer in the span of a few hours. Or maybe it was the fact that the man was still out there, a loose end waiting to be tied up. Whatever it was, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this case was different, that it was meant for him. By the time dinner was over, Ethan was already itching to get back to his room. He helped clear the table, then made a beeline for the stairs, ignoring his mom's protests about dessert. He had work to do. Back at his desk, Ethan pulled up a map of the area and began plotting the suspect's possible escape routes. He cross-referenced traffic cameras, toll booth records, and eyewitness reports, slowly narrowing down the options. The pickup truck had been spotted heading west, toward the state line. If Ethan was right, the suspect was trying to disappear into the rural backroads, where the cops would have a harder time tracking him. But Ethan wasn't the cops. He was something else entirely. And as he stared at the map, a plan began to take shape. He didn't know why, but he felt like he was meant to find this man. Like it was his responsibility. "All right, Jack," Ethan murmured, typing the name he'd just uncovered into his search bar. "Let's see what you're made of." The screens flickered with data, and Ethan leaned in, his eyes gleaming with determination. The game was on. Chapter 4, The Detective. Detective Victor Eastman stood in the dimly lit gas station parking lot, the flashing lights of patrol cars painting the scene in alternating shades of red and blue. The body of Carl Henderson had been removed, but the chalk outline on the pavement and the bloodstains were stark reminders of what had happened here. Victor crouched down, his sharp eyes scanning the ground for anything the forensics team might have missed. He was a seasoned detective, with a reputation for closing cases that others couldn't. At 45, he had the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much, deep lines around his eyes, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and a nose that had been broken one too many times. But beneath the weariness was a mind that never stopped working, a relentless drive to piece together the truth. Victor's gloved hand brushed against something under the edge of the gas pump. He picked it up and held it up to the light, a worn leather wallet. He flipped it open and found a driver's license inside. The face staring back at him was familiar, though it took him a moment to place it. Jack Malone. The name clicked into place. Malone had been a person of interest in a few low-level cases over the years. Nothing major, just small-time stuff. But this was a whole different league. Gotcha, Victor muttered, slipping the wallet into an evidence bag. He straightened up and walked over to his unmarked car, his mind already racing. Jack Malone was his guy. Now he just had to figure out where he'd gone. Back at the precinct, Victor spread out the contents of Jack's wallet on his desk. Credit cards, a few crumpled receipts, and a faded photo of a younger Jack with his arm around another guy. Victor picked up the photo and studied it. The other guy looked familiar too, but he couldn't place him. He turned to his computer and started digging. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. A quick search of Jack's social media profiles led him to an old high school photo album. There he was, the guy from the picture, Ethan Cross. According to the captions, Jack and Ethan had been best friends back in the day. Victor scrolled through the photos, noting the dates. The two had been inseparable in high school, but the pictures stopped abruptly about 5 years ago. Whatever friendship they'd had, it had fizzled out. Victor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Ethan Cross. The name rang a bell. He did a quick search and found a few articles about an amateur internet detective who'd helped solve a couple of cold cases. Interesting. If Ethan was as good as the articles made him out to be, he might have some insight into Jack's whereabouts. And if they'd been close once, maybe Ethan knew something about Jack's motives. Victor grabbed his coat and headed for the door. It was time to pay Ethan Cross a visit. The Cross family home was a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Victor parked his car at the curb and walked up the driveway, his detective's badge glinting in the sunlight. He knocked on the door and waited, his sharp eyes taking in the details of the house. A bike leaned against the garage, and a pair of sneakers sat by the door. Someone was home. The door opened, and a woman in her late 50s peered out at him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Mrs. Cross?" Victor asked, flashing his badge. "I'm Detective Victor Eastman. I'm looking for Ethan. Is he home?" Mrs. Cross hesitated, then nodded. "He's upstairs. Is everything okay?" "Just need to ask him a few questions," Victor said, keeping his tone neutral. "Mind if I come in?" She stepped aside, and Victor followed her into the house. The living room was cozy but cluttered, with family photos covering the walls. Mrs. Cross called up the stairs. "Ethan, there's a detective here to see you." A moment later, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He was younger than Victor had expected, early 20s, with messy brown hair and glasses that made him look more like a college student than an internet sleuth. But there was a sharpness in his eyes, a quiet intelligence that Victor recognized immediately. "Ethan Cross?" Victor asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yeah," Ethan said, coming down the stairs. "What's this about?" Victor held up the photo he'd found in Jack's wallet. "You know this guy?" Ethan's eyes widened as he took the photo. That's Jack. Jack Malone. We used to be friends. Why are you asking about him?" Victor studied Ethan's face, looking for any sign of deception. "Jack's wanted for armed robbery and murder. He killed a man during a heist earlier today. I found this photo in his wallet. Thought you might know something that could help us find him." Ethan's face went pale, and he sank onto the bottom step, staring at the photo. "Jack? Murder? I can't believe it. He wasn't like that. Not back then, anyway." "People change," Victor said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to find him before he hurts anyone else. If you know anything at all, now's the time to tell me." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the case he'd been working on, the hours he'd spent piecing together Jack's movements. He thought about the man he'd once called his best friend, and the stranger he'd become. Finally, he looked up at Victor, his expression resolute. "I might be able to help," he said. "But you're not going to like how I got the information." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Ethan took a deep breath. "I've been tracking Jack online. I think I know where he's headed." Victor's lips curved into a faint smile. This kid was full of surprises. "All right, Ethan. Let's talk." Chapter 5, On the Run. Jack Malone's hands gripped the steering wheel of the stolen pickup truck as he pulled into the sprawling parking lot of a 24-hour superstore. The fluorescent lights of the store buzzed like a swarm of angry bees, casting an unnatural glow over the rows of cars. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. He needed to think, to regroup. The gas station shooting had left him rattled, and losing his wallet had only made things worse. No ID, no credit cards, no cash, Just the duffel bag of stolen money in the back of the truck, and even that felt like a ticking time bomb. He parked the truck at the far end of the lot, away from the security cameras, and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked like hell, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hair a mess. He barely recognized himself. The man staring back at him wasn't the Jack Malone who'd started this day. That man was gone, replaced by someone desperate, someone dangerous. Jack grabbed the duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, then hesitated. Carrying a bag full of cash into a superstore was a surefire way to get noticed. He glanced around, then stuffed the bag under the seat. He'd come back for it later. Right now, he needed supplies. Camping gear, food, water. Anything that would help him disappear into the woods until he could figure out his next move. The automatic doors slid open with a cheerful ding, and Jack stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The store was nearly empty, save for a few late-night shoppers and a tired-looking cashier. He grabbed a cart and headed for the camping aisle, his eyes darting around as he went. He felt exposed, like every security camera was trained on him, every shopper a potential threat. He moved quickly, tossing items into the cart. A backpack, a sleeping bag, a tent, a portable stove, canned food, a water filter, and a hunting knife. He hesitated in front of the gun aisle, then grabbed a box of ammunition for the handgun he still had tucked in his waistband. He didn't want to use it again, but he wasn't taking any chances. As he approached the checkout, Jack kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the cashier. He paid with the last of the cash he had in his pocket, his hands trembling as he counted out the bills. The cashier didn't seem to notice, or if she didn't care. Jack grabbed his bags and hurried out of the store, his heart pounding in his chest. He was halfway across the parking lot when he saw them. Police cars, their lights flashing, surrounding the stolen pickup truck. His stomach dropped. They'd found him. How? He'd been so careful. He froze for a moment, his mind racing, then forced himself to keep walking, to act normal. He couldn't panic. Not now. As he got closer, he could see the officers searching the truck, pulling the duffel bag out from under the seat. Jack's heart sank. There went the money, his only lifeline. He had nothing now. No money, no ID, no way out. Just the camping supplies in his hands and the gun at his side. He turned on his heel and walked briskly back toward the store, his pulse thundering in his ears. He couldn't go back to the truck. He couldn't let them catch him. Not like this. He pushed through the automatic doors, ignoring the curious looks from the cashier, and headed straight for the back of the store. There had to be another way out. He found it near the stockroom, an employee's entrance with a push bar and a faded exit sign above it. Jack shoved the door open and stepped into the cool night air. The back of the store was dimly lit, the parking lot empty except for a few dumpsters and a chain-link fence. Beyond the fence was a dense line of trees. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped the bags of camping supplies and climbed the fence, his muscles screaming in protest. He landed hard on the other side, then grabbed the bags and hauled them over after him. The sound of sirens grew louder behind him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. He plunged into the woods, the darkness swallowing him whole. The trees were thick, the underbrush clawing at his legs as he ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The police would be after him soon, if they weren't already. He had to disappear, to become invisible. As he ran, his mind raced. He'd lost everything, the money, the truck, his wallet. All he had left was the gun, the camping supplies, and the clothes on his back. He was a fugitive now, with no way out and no one to turn to. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not ever. The woods stretched out ahead of him, endless and unforgiving. Jack Malone was a man on the run, and the night was far from over. Chapter 6: The Digital Trail. Ethan's room was a chaotic blend of technology and clutter, a reflection of his restless mind. Detective Victor Eastman stepped inside, his sharp eyes taking in the 3 glowing monitors, the tangled cables, and the whiteboard covered in cryptic notes. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and overheated electronics. Victor raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd seen worse. "Sorry about the mess," Ethan muttered, clearing a stack of energy drink cans off a chair so Victor could sit. "I don't really get visitors." "I'm not here to judge your housekeeping," Victor said, sitting down. "Show me what you've got." Ethan nodded and pulled up a chair in front of his monitors. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a series of windows, social media profiles, email accounts, and credit card statements. Victor watched in silence, his expression unreadable, as Ethan explained his process. "I've been tracking Jack's digital footprint," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "He's not exactly a tech genius, so he's left a trail. Social media, old emails, even some online purchases. But so far, nothing recent. It's like he's gone dark." Victor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're telling me you can't find him?" "I didn't say that," Ethan replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "I'm just saying it's not easy. He's smart enough to know he's being hunted. But everyone slips up eventually." Victor didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he watched as Ethan continued to work, his fingers dancing across the keyboard. The minutes ticked by, the only sound in the room the soft hum of the computer fans and the occasional click of the mouse. Just as Ethan was about to pull up another lead, Victor's phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket and answered, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Eastman." Ethan couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could tell from Victor's expression that it was important. The detective's eyes narrowed, and he stood up, pacing the room as he listened. "You found the truck off 75, near Whitman Park?" Victor said, his tone clipped. "Yes, I'm on my way." He hung up and turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, kid," he said, though his tone was anything but grateful. "You've been helpful." With that, Victor turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the stairs. Ethan sat in silence for a moment, his mind racing. Whitman Park. That name stuck in his head. Why did it sound familiar? Then it hit him. Memories of high school came flooding back. Nights spent at an old cabin in the woods near Whitman Park. Jack had thrown parties there, back when they were still friends. It was secluded, off the grid, the perfect place to disappear. Ethan hadn't thought about that cabin in years, but now it all came rushing back. He pulled up a browser tab and navigated to a house rental website. He typed in Whitman Park and waited as the results loaded. A few seconds later, he found what he was looking for. The same old cabin, now listed for rent. The address was remote, the kind of place someone might go to hide. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Jack was out there, and now Ethan had a pretty good idea where. He grabbed his phone and started typing out a message to Victor, but then stopped. The detective hadn't exactly been impressed with his skills. Maybe it was time to take matters into his own hands. He stood up and grabbed his jacket, his mind already racing with plans. If Jack was hiding in that cabin, Ethan was going to find him. And this time, he wasn't going to wait for the cops to catch up. The game was far from over. Chapter 7. Into the Woods. The back of the superstore was a chaotic scene, lit by the harsh glow of floodlights and the flashing red and blue of police cruisers. Officers moved in tight formations, their voices sharp and urgent, while 9 units barked and strained against their leashes. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes when a hunt is on but the prey is slipping away. Detective Victor Eastman stood at the edge of the chaos, his jaw clenched and his eyes scanning the tree line. His coffee cup was still in his hand, though it had long gone cold. A low-level officer approached him, hesitating before delivering the news. "Detective, the dogs lost the scent trail over the creek," the officer said, his voice cautious. "It's too dark to keep searching tonight. We'll have to pick it up in the morning with sunlight." Victor's head snapped toward the officer, his eyes blazing. "Morning? You think Malone's just going to sit around and wait for us to find him? He's out there right now, and every second we waste, he's getting farther away." Before the officer could respond, Victor hurled his coffee cup at the side of the building. It shattered, the dark liquid splattering against the brick like a stain. The nearby officers froze, their eyes darting toward the outburst but quickly looking away. No one wanted to be on the receiving end of Victor's temper. Victor turned on his heel and stormed back to his car, his mind racing. He couldn't wait for morning. He couldn't rely on the dogs or the uniforms or anyone else. If they weren't going to do their jobs, he'd do it himself. He popped the trunk of his unmarked sedan and pulled out his AR-15, slinging it over his shoulder. The weight of the rifle was familiar, comforting even. He checked the magazine, then grabbed a flashlight and a handful of extra ammo. He didn't need a search party. He didn't need backup. He just needed to find Jack Malone. "I'll go after him myself," Victor muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He slammed the trunk shut and marched toward the tree line, his boots crunching on the gravel. Without breaking stride, he hopped the chain-link fence and disappeared into the woods. For a moment, the officers stood in stunned silence. Then one of them, a younger cop with wide eyes, turned to his partner. "Did he just—" "Yeah," the partner said, his voice grim. "He did." The younger cop hesitated, then grabbed his radio. "We've got a situation. Detective Eastman just went into the woods alone. He's armed and he's not waiting for backup." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. "Copy that. Form a team and follow him." Now, a handful of officers scrambled to grab their gear, their movements hurried but disciplined. They knew Victor's reputation, reckless, relentless, and always on the edge. If he was going after Malone alone, there was no telling what might happen. They couldn't afford to let him go rogue. Meanwhile, Victor pushed deeper into the woods, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The trees were thick, their branches clawing at him as he moved. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip him with every step. But Victor didn't slow down. He couldn't. Jack Malone was out here somewhere, and Victor wasn't leaving without him. Behind him, the faint sounds of the officers following echoed through the trees. They were trying to catch up, but Victor wasn't waiting. He had a lead, a hunch, and a burning need to finish this. The woods were vast, but Victor knew one thing for certain. Jack Malone wasn't getting away. Not tonight. Not ever. The hunt was on. Chapter 8. The Ambush. The woods were alive with the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But for Jack Malone, the only sound that mattered was the pounding of his own heart and the ragged gasps of his breath. He was freezing, his clothes soaked through from the creek, and his body ached with every step. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't an outdoorsman, and every second in the wilderness felt like a betrayal of his own nature. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. His mind raced as he stumbled through the darkness, trying to remember the layout of the woods. The old cabin, the one he used to throw parties at in high school, had to be nearby. Somewhere north, over a ridge or two. If he could just make it there, he could regroup, maybe find a way out of this mess. But the woods all looked the same in the dark, and his sense of direction was failing him. Then it happened. His foot caught on a root, and he pitched forward, landing hard between two jagged rocks. Pain shot through his leg, sharp and immediate. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled beneath him. Broken. He cursed under his breath, his hands trembling as he felt the swelling already beginning. He was done running. The sound of voices reached him through the trees, faint but unmistakable. The police were closing in. He could hear them splashing through the creek, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like knives. They'd left the dogs behind, but they weren't giving up. Jack knew he couldn't outrun them now, not with a broken leg. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He dragged himself behind a thick tree, his back pressed against the rough bark. His hand found the gun at his side, and he gripped it tightly, his finger resting on the trigger. He could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder. They were almost on top of him. Jack held his breath, his body tense. He waited until the first officer passed him, then the second. They were moving quickly, their focus ahead, not beside them. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he counted the footsteps. 3, 4, 5. Then he moved. He swung out from behind the tree, his gun raised. The first shot rang out, echoing through the woods. An officer went down, then another. Chaos erupted as the police scrambled for cover, their flashlights swinging wildly. Jack fired again and again, his movements frantic but precise. He didn't have time to think, only to act. Victor Eastman was among them, his AR-15 slung over his shoulder. He dove behind a tree as bullets whizzed past him, one grazing his arm. He cursed, his blood boiling as he heard the cries of his fellow officers. Jack Malone wasn't just running, he was fighting back. The exchange of gunfire was brief but brutal. Jack took a shot to the stomach, the impact knocking him back. He stumbled, his hand clutching the wound as blood seeped through his fingers. He knew he was done. He couldn't keep this up. With the last of his strength, Jack turned and hurled himself into the creek. The cold water hit him like a shock, but he didn't stop. He let the current take him, his body floating downstream into the darkness. The voices of the police faded behind him, replaced by the rush of the water and the pounding of his own heartbeat. On the bank, Victor emerged from cover, his face twisted in rage. "Malone!" he screamed, his voice raw and guttural. "You're not getting away. Do you hear me? You're not getting away." But there was no response, only the sound of the creek and the distant howl of the wind. Jack Malone was gone, swallowed by the night. And Victor Eastman was left standing in the woods, his arm bleeding, his men dead, and a fire burning in his chest that wouldn't be extinguished until he found the man who'd done this. The hunt was far from over. Chapter 9: The Lie. The gas station near Whitman Park was a relic of another era, its flickering neon sign buzzing faintly in the cool night air. Ethan sat in the passenger seat of his mom's sedan, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. His mom, a woman in her late 40s with the same sharp eyes as her son, tapped her fingers on the steering wheel as she waited for the tank to fill. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "where is this bingo place you told me about? I thought you said it was close." Ethan's stomach churned. He hated lying to her, but he didn't have a choice. He couldn't drive himself, and there was no way she'd agree to take him to Whitman Park if she knew the real reason he wanted to go. He forced a smile and shrugged, trying to sound casual. "It's, just a little farther up the road," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the dark stretch of highway ahead. "I guess I misjudged the distance. Sorry about that." His mom raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Ethan, you're not dragging me out here for some silly reason, are you? You know I don't like driving at night." "No, Mom, I swear," Ethan said, his voice a little too high-pitched. "It's just a new place. I heard about it from a friend. Thought it'd be fun, you know? Something different." She studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing, and Ethan felt like she could see right through him. But then she sighed and shook her head. "All right, but if this turns out to be a waste of time, you're doing the dishes for a month." Got it, Ethan said, relief flooding through him. He climbed out of the car to finish filling the tank, his mind racing. He bought himself a little more time, but he still needed to get her to drive the rest of the way to the cabin. And that meant coming up with another lie. As he screwed the gas cap back on, an idea struck him. It was ridiculous, but it might just work. He slid back into the passenger seat and buckled his seatbelt, trying to look as innocent as possible. "So, I just remembered something," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "My friend mentioned there's this, really cool lookout point near here. You can see the whole valley from up there. It's supposed to be amazing at night. Maybe we could check it out before bingo." His mom gave him a sideways glance. "A lookout point? Ethan, it's pitch black out there. What are we supposed to see? I don't know, stars or something?" Ethan said, shrugging. It's supposed to be really peaceful. And it's not far from here. Like 10 minutes tops." She sighed again, clearly exasperated, but Ethan could tell she was softening. "Fine," she said, putting the car in gear. "But if this turns out to be another one of your wild goose chases, you're doing the laundry too." "Deal," Ethan said, trying to hide his relief. He directed her down the winding road that led toward the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he'd find when they got there, but he knew one thing for certain. Jack Malone was close. And Ethan wasn't leaving until he found him. The car rolled on, its headlights cutting through the darkness as they climbed higher into the woods. Ethan stared out the window, his mind racing with possibilities. He just hoped his mom wouldn't ask too many questions when they got to the cabin. Because if she did, he wasn't sure he could come up with another lie. Chapter 10: The Setup. The old cabin stood silent and shadowed under the pale glow of the moon, its weathered boards creaking faintly in the night breeze. The windows were dark, the porch sagging, and the surrounding woods seemed to press in on it like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Ethan stepped out of the car, his heart pounding as he scanned the area. This was it, the cabin Jack used to throw parties at in high school. If Jack was anywhere nearby, this was where he'd come. Ethan's mom stayed in the driver's seat, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of frustration and confusion. "Ethan, what are we doing here? This isn't a bingo hall, and it's definitely not a lookout point. You lied to me." Ethan turned to her, his mind racing. He didn't have time to explain, not fully. "Not yet. Mom, I know this looks weird, but I need you to trust me. Just give me 5 minutes, okay? I'll explain everything later." She opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan was already moving, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't wait for her response. He didn't have the luxury of time. Jack could be close, and Ethan needed to set up the trail cameras before it was too late. The cabin's surroundings were overgrown, the grass tall and the trees dense. Ethan moved quickly but quietly, his eyes scanning for the best spots to place the cameras. He'd bought them months ago, originally intending to use them for a wildlife photography project he'd never gotten around to. Now they were his only hope of catching Jack. He placed the first camera on a tree near the front of the cabin, angling it to capture the porch and the path leading up to it. The second went on a low branch overlooking the back door, and the third he tucked into the bushes near the edge of the property, aimed at the tree line. Each camera was motion-activated, designed to capture anything that moved within its range. If Jack came anywhere near this cabin, Ethan would know. As he worked, he could feel his mom's eyes on him from the car. He knew she was upset, and he hated lying to her, but this was bigger than that. Jack was out there, and Ethan was the only one who could find him. He just hoped she'd understand when this was all over. Once the cameras were in place, Ethan hurried back to the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. His mom was still glaring at him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Well," she said, her tone sharp, "are you going to tell me what's going on, or am I just supposed to sit here and guess?" Ethan hesitated, then decided to give her a sliver of the truth. "Mom, I know this looks bad, but I'm trying to help someone. An old friend. He's in trouble, and I think he might come here. I needed to set these up so I can keep an eye on the place." Her expression softened slightly, but she still looked skeptical. "An old friend? Ethan, you're not mixed up in something dangerous, are you?" "No," Ethan said quickly, shaking his head. "It's not like that. I need to do this. Please, just trust me." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but we're talking about this later. And if I find out you're lying to me again—" "I'm not," Ethan said, cutting her off. "I promise." She didn't look entirely convinced, but she didn't argue. Ethan climbed back into the car, his mind already racing ahead. The cameras were in place, and now all he could do was wait. Jack was out there, and Ethan was determined to find him, no matter what it took. As they drove away from the cabin, Ethan glanced back one last time, his stomach churning with a mix of guilt and determination. He hated lying to his mom, but he didn't have a choice. This was bigger than both of them. And when this was all over, he'd make it up to her. For now, though, the game was on, and Ethan wasn't about to let Jack Malone slip away. Chapter 11, The Call. Ethan woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. The pale light of dawn filtered through his curtains, casting the room in a soft gray glow. He rubbed his eyes and reached for the phone, his heart sinking as he saw the notifications. News alerts. Headlines. His stomach churned as he read them. Fugitive wanted in armored truck heist kills multiple officers in shootout. Jack Malone, armed and dangerous. Manhunt intensifies for suspect in Whitman Park area. Ethan sat up, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the articles. Jack's face was everywhere, his high school yearbook photo, grainy surveillance stills, and even a sketch of what he might look like now. The details were sparse but damning. Jack had ambushed a group of officers, killing several before disappearing into the night. The manhunt was nationwide now, and it was only a matter of time before they caught him. Ethan's chest tightened. He'd known Jack was in trouble, but this was worse than he'd imagined. His old friend wasn't just a thief anymore. He was a killer. Before he could process it all, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an alert from the trail cameras he'd set up at the cabin. His heart leapt into his throat as he opened the app and saw the footage. There, clear as day, was Jack. He was limping badly, clutching his side as he stumbled toward the cabin. Blood stained his clothes, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked like a man on the edge of collapse. Then it hit him. The cabin had a landline. He might be able to reach Jack before it was too late. Ethan grabbed his laptop and started hacking into the phone database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. The cabin's landline number popped up on the screen, and Ethan didn't hesitate. He dialed the number, his heart pounding as the phone rang. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then a click. Voicemail. Ethan's voice was shaky as he spoke. "Hello. Jack. Are you there? Can you pick up the phone? It's me, Ethan." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a voice. Raspy, weak, but unmistakably Jack's. "Ethan? What the hell are you doing?" Ethan's breath caught. "Jack, I saw the news. What happened? Why did you do it?" Jack's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "Why did I do it? You think I had a choice, Ethan? You think I woke up one day and decided, hey, let's rob an armored truck and kill a bunch of cops? You don't know what my life's been like. You don't know anything." Ethan's chest tightened. "Jack, I'm trying to understand. Just talk to me. Understand." Jack snapped, his voice rising. "You grew up in your nice little house with your nice little family. You don't know what it's like to have parents who don't give a damn about you, who spend every dime on drugs and leave you to fend for yourself. You don't know what it's like to have nothing, Ethan. Nothing. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, he heard it. Gunshots, loud and sharp, echoing through the phone. Jack cursed, and the line went dead. Ethan's hands were shaking as he pulled up the trail camera feed. The footage was grainy, but he could see it clearly. Detective Victor Eastman, crouched behind a tree near the cabin, his AR-15 in his hands. He was alone, no other officers in sight. The gunshots had come from him. Chapter 12, The Inferno. Ethan sat hunched over his laptop, his eyes glued to the live feed from the trail cameras he'd set up around the cabin. The grainy footage showed Jack limping toward the cabin, clutching his side, his face pale and drawn. Moments later, Detective Victor Eastman appeared, crouched behind a tree, his AR-15 slung over his shoulder. The tension was palpable, even through the screen. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't want to help Jack escape. He wanted this to end. He wanted Jack to turn himself in before anyone else got hurt. But as the first gunshot rang out, Ethan knew it was too late for that. The shootout was chaotic. Jack fired from inside the cabin, his shots wild and desperate. Victor returned fire, his movements precise and calculated. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Ethan could hear the distant echoes of the gunfire through the trail camera's audio feed, each shot making him flinch. Then, something unexpected happened. Jack, cornered and bleeding, did the unthinkable. Ethan watched in horror as Jack grabbed a lighter from his pocket and set the cabin's curtains ablaze. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the dry wood and the chaos of the moment. Flames licked up the walls, casting an eerie orange glow over the scene. Victor, caught off guard by the sudden inferno, hesitated. In that split second, Jack fired again. The bullet struck Victor in the leg, and the detective went down, cursing as he clutched his wound. The cabin was now fully engulfed in flames, the heat distorting the camera's feed. Ethan's hands trembled as he watched. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. This was his fault. He'd set up the cameras, he'd led Victor to the cabin, and now people were getting hurt, or worse. He felt sick to his stomach, but he forced himself to keep watching. He needed to see how this ended. Inside the cabin, Jack was a shadow moving through the flames. He stumbled toward the back door, coughing and choking on the smoke. Victor, despite his injury, managed to drag himself behind a tree, out of the line of fire. The flames roared, consuming the cabin. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't call the police. They were already there. He couldn't warn Victor. The detective was injured and trapped. All he could do was watch as the situation spiraled further out of control. The cabin collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Jack was nowhere to be seen. Victor, bleeding and battered, managed to crawl farther away from the flames, his face a mask of pain and determination. Ethan sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. He didn't know if Jack had made it out alive. He didn't know if Victor would survive his injuries. All he knew was that this nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. The screen flickered as the trail camera's feed began to glitch, the heat and smoke interfering with the signal. Ethan stared at the static, his mind racing. He'd wanted to help, to stop Jack from hurting anyone else. But now, as he watched the cabin burn and the chaos unfold, he realized he was powerless. The only thing left to do was wait, and hope that no one else would die tonight. Chapter 13, The Final Hunt. Ethan's fingers flew across his keyboard, the glow of his monitors casting sharp shadows across his face. The trail camera feeds were still up, but the fire had destroyed one of the cameras, and the others were glitching from the heat and smoke. He needed a better way to help, and fast. Victor was injured, Jack was on the run, and the cabin was a smoldering ruin. Ethan couldn't just sit and watch anymore. He opened a new window and began hacking into the local police department's database. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this, but the stakes had never been this high. His heart pounded as he bypassed firewalls and decrypted files, searching for Victor Eastman's contact information. It took less than 5 minutes to find what he was looking for: Victor's cell phone number. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed, his hands trembling. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Eastman," Victor's voice came through, sharp but strained. Ethan could hear the pain in his tone. "Detective Eastman, it's Ethan Cross," Ethan said quickly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm the one who set up the trail cameras at the cabin. I can see everything. I can help you." There was a pause, then Victor's voice, low and cautious. "How do I know this isn't a trick?" "You don't," Ethan said bluntly. But right now you're bleeding in the woods and Jack Malone is out there. You need my help. Another pause, then a grunt of pain. Fine. What do you see? Ethan switched back to his laptop, pulling up the remaining camera feeds. The fire had died down, but the smoke still obscured parts of the footage. He scanned the screens, his eyes darting from one angle to another. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement near the tree line. Jack! He's moving east, Ethan said, his voice urgent. About 50 yards from your position. He's using the smoke for cover. Do you see the big oak tree with the split trunk? Yeah, Victor said, his voice tight. I see it. He's behind it, Ethan said. He's crouched low, trying to stay hidden. If you move northwest, you can flank him. Victor didn't respond, but Ethan heard the rustle of movement through the phone. He watched the camera feed as Victor, despite his injured leg, began to crawl toward the oak tree. Jack was still there, unaware that he was being hunted. Ethan's stomach churned as he watched. He didn't want Jack to die, but he couldn't let him keep running. Too many people had already been hurt. This had to end. He's still there, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're almost in position. Victor didn't reply, but Ethan could hear his labored breathing. The detective was close now, just a few yards away from Jack. Ethan held his breath, his eyes glued to the screen. Then suddenly Jack stood up. He was looking in the wrong direction, his back to Victor. It was now or never. Take the shot, Ethan said, his voice firm. Do it now. The crack of a gunshot echoed through the phone, and Ethan flinched. On the camera feed, Jack crumpled to the ground, his body limp. Victor stood over him, his gun still raised, his face unreadable. Ethan sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. It was over. Jack was dead. Victor had won. But as he stared at the screen, watching Victor lower his gun and slump against a tree, Ethan didn't feel relief. He felt empty. Jack had been his friend once, a long time ago. And now he was gone. Victor's voice came through the phone, breaking the silence. It's done. Ethan swallowed hard. Yeah, it's done. He ended the call and closed his laptop, the room suddenly feeling too quiet. The hunt was over, but the weight of what had happened would stay with him for a long time. Jack was gone, Victor was injured, and Ethan was left to wonder if there had been another way. But for now, all he could do was sit in the silence. The end.